Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 2 of our Tamurkhan Legendary Lord lore video. If you missed part 1, there'll be a link popping up in the top right hand corner now, and you'll find a link down in the description below. And if you do like my videos, do consider joining or subscribing, or even just dropping a like. Any little bit helps the channel. Got some exclusive content for our members already in the members section, including parts 4 and 5 of our ongoing Malice series, if you want to check that out. And we are revisiting the old retro game Shadow of the Horned Rat. But other than that, please sit back and enjoy as we conclude the tale of Tamurkhan the Maggot Lord. The time had come as Tamurkhan looked out upon the blasted land in the shadow of the great fortress and growled impatiently through his ruined jaws. The horde was at last breaking camp, moving out once more on its bloody course to reap ruin upon the empire of men. Half a year's turning had passed since the Battle of the High Crags had broken open the way to the west for Tamurkhan. The horde now found itself on the shores of the River Ruin, looking to cross and enter the dark empire of Zar at the great river crossing, over which, like an obsidian dagger thrust into the burning, smoke-laden skies, the black fortress of the Chaos Dwarves stood sentinel. On the opposite bank of the river, across the shallow causeways, was the only place a force as large and unwieldy as Tamurkhan's horde might cross into the Darklands for many leagues. Lord Drazoath the Ashen had drawn up his army to this place. Here, Tamurkhan's thousands would face rank after rank of compact, regimented figures encased from head to toe in thick ornate armor woven from smoldering steel scales and thick, blackened plates. Brutal blades and strange ornate weapons beating a deadly rhythm in unison against brazen shields. All throughout their lines were batteries of nightmarish war engines, demon-fused cannon, and gaping-mouthed mortars. At the flanks, great mobs of hobgoblin slave soldiers cowered and fretted under the cruel lashes of their overseers, ready to be spent as a living shield of blood and bone for their callous masters. Tamurkhan, the rotting champion of Nurgle, knew he had the power and might to force the crossing, even against the legendary wrath of the Chaos Dwarves of Zarna Grund. The sheer fury and monstrous power of his horde would see to that, but the cost would be high indeed. Each of the two generals perhaps had an echo of some other outcome of the confrontation rather than mutual destruction in mind from the start. But first, both pride and the desires of the dark gods must be born. There would be blood. The war horns rang out, and carnage commenced. For many hours the tide of chaos crashed upon the army of the Lords of Hashut. In wave after wave it advanced upon the thin line of Chaos Dwarves, only to be beaten back under a hail of arrows and gunfire. Strange missiles leapt from the Chaos Dwarf ranks and fell upon their enemies with great resounding crashes like thunder. Warriors and beasts were blown into so many pieces of shredded flesh and mangled iron, or burned, the flames charring their flesh, even under the waters of the Black River Ruin. Yet, like the tide, the army of Tamurkhan came on relentlessly. As one warrior fell, another stepped into his place. Soon, the supply trains of the army of Zar began to come under attack from above. Winged beasts, rotting wing corpse vultures, and demon furies struck from the skies, while sorcerer's lightning arced down to burn and blast, causing powder kegs to erupt in lethal fireballs, incinerating all around them. Soon enough, the Chaos Dwarves' guns slowed. Many were struck silent, their ammunition and powder spent. Slowly, the horde regrouped to renew the attack, and this time the Dolgan war mammoths were to lead the assault. And behind them, heavily armored Chaos Knights and warriors were taking up key positions before the foe. The morning's battle had simply been a preliminary attempt to draw the enemy's fire. The Chaos Dwarves had unknowingly wasted their cannons and powder on the most expendable parts of the Horde. Mutated cultists, wild monsters, savage or mindless spawn, and those so blessed by Chaos's corrupting touch, they were glad to seek death rather than live another day. Of course, some sacrifice had been necessary. Thousands of Kurgan lay dead or dying, as well as hundreds of Tamurkhan's plague ogres. That the path to glory was awash with blood, no one could ever deny. Tamurkhan had saved his best troops and ordered his crushing mammoths across the causeway. Even the Infernal Guard could not hold back such a weight of muscle and fury, and the center of the line of the far bank was shattered in the huge beast's first mighty assault. The retreat became a disarrayed rout as the weapons of the Kurgan fell mercilessly upon the orcs and hobgoblins who made up the greatest part of the slave army, and many more of the cowardly creatures died in the rush to escape as the panicked hobgoblins fought and clawed over each other in their eagerness to flee. Those not trampled to death by their comrades were simply buried and suffocated in the press. Isolated blocks of Chaos Dwarves stood their ground rather than face the ignominy of being cut down in flight. Both at their war machines and in defensive squares of steel-shod warriors, they fought savagely and bravely, but they stood little chance as the Horde washed over them. There was great slaughter on both sides, but soon the victory was Tamurkhan's. It was Sail the Faithless, sorcerer and advisor to Tamurkhan, he of the twisted flesh and serpent's tongue, that was chosen as an emissary in Tamurkhan's stead to deliver his word to the Chaos Dwarves, now holed up into their near impregnable fortress. Although useful, Tamurkhan ultimately considered him expendable, should the Dawizar choose to make a point by destroying him. Tamurkhan's message to the Chaos Dwarf Lord was thus: "Know that I, Tamurkhan, son of the great Kurgan, master of hosts, bringer of desolation, champion of the Lord of Decay, speak. Would you, Lord Drazoath, perish, knowing that your land will be despoiled and your fortress plundered? By all, witness of the dark gods, you have fought with honor and brought glory to thy master. Now yield without shame. Our war is not with the lords of Hashut, but with the lands of men. Join us, grant us the blessing of steel, and thy fell arts of war, and the spoils of victory shall fall to all alike, as it has been before between the Kurgan and the sons of Zar. Let it be again, and a pact struck between us." The dwarves seemed amenable to an alliance, but whatever their motivations, the negotiations were long and difficult, before at last a deal was struck. Over the next several months, the Chaos Horde aided the Chaos Dwarves in the long-disused mine known as Gulakfa, driving out a Black Orc tribe, and set out ranging far and wide with great slaughter along the Scalded Delta, sending a steady stream of captives to the Dark Empire. In return, caravans pulled by strange, ash-blackened beasts and steaming, clanking machines, the likes of which no Norscan had ever seen, arrived night and day at Gulakfa, bearing bushels of weapons and darkly forged war gear to re-equip the Horde. Ceaselessly, deep within the bowels of the Black Fortress and the distant Tower of Gorgoth, hellish furnaces which burned flesh and souls as much as coal and tinder blazed and hammered and resounded with sacrificial screams, as under Drazoath's direction preparations were made for his legion and its malevolent engines of war to go west with Tamurkhan's horde, not as followers, but allies against a chosen foe. The sworn pact was that for the aid of the demon smith's might in bringing down the great city of Magnus the Pious, the dwarves would in return have their pick of prisoners and battlefield plunder, and then the bargain would be complete. As preparations were made for the journey west, and in honor of the bargain struck, Tamurkhan and his warriors joined in battle alongside the legions of Asgore against one of their most terrible ancient foes, the dragon Omdra the Dread. This monster of legend had stirred once more, and soon its dominion carried across the northern plain of bones, and its colossal black-winged shadow scattered all before it in nightmare and terror. No mere beast, however great its size, was Omdra, but an ancient and wicked creature, with dark magics to match even the vaunted skills of Sile, the preeminent sorcerer amongst Tamurkhan's horde. At the inhuman will of Omdra, gargantuan moorworms rose up from the black sands to give battle alongside packs of wanton and hungry crypt ghouls, to whom the dragon was no less than a god, and threw themselves with savage piety against the Kurgan. In this battle were thousands slain, both Kurgan and Chaos Dwarf together. At great cost in blood and sorcery was the dragon god herself gravely injured and driven away to slumber beneath the bones of her dead kin. Her threat to the desolation of Asgore broken, at least for a time. In return for this effusion of slaughter on their behalf, the servants of Hashut honored Tamurkhan with a gift of a war axe fit to his stature, a darkly enchanted blade to replace the tyrant which had shattered on the granite-hard skin of a moorworm in battle. Also, at Tamurkhan's behest, they took the near 100 giants that still fought with the Horde and worked their arts of forgecraft and sorcery on them, encasing them in plated iron and fitting them with great hooked blades and picks, the better to scale and sunder the fortifications the Horde must face when it reached its destination. These ironclad monstrosities became known as siege giants. After a time, Tamurkhan grew impatient to move onwards, wary that his horde's numbers were steadily bleeding away battle by battle, and conscious too that the omens were beginning to turn against him. Dark rumors and whispered words borne upon wings of sorcery from 1,000 leagues northward spoke that other forces even now assailed the Empire, and other mighty champions clamored for the Dark God's attention with their great and terrible deeds. Even within his own ranks, while his might remained unquestioned, as did Tamurkhan's devotion to the Father of Decay, some spoke of the changes recently wrought upon his stolen tyrant's body, and that they were perhaps a mark of the Plague God's judgment. Either that ascension or destruction was soon to be at hand. Great had been Tamurkhan's glory, for he had carved a trail of desolation across half the world, it seemed. He had led the Horde where warlords before him had feared to tread. The number of bodies that lay at his feet could not easily be counted, but the city of the thrice-cursed Magnus he had promised the Dark Gods had yet to be delivered. At last, in a council of war, Tamurkhan declared the time had come to render up the final victory to the Chaos Gods, and the horde of the Maggot Lord set forth once again westwards, where they meant to cross the World-Edge Mountains at Death Pass, which at this time was the least opposed and closest route. For at the time a great army of Orcs and Skaven had fought each other to near annihilation in a battle to control it. With the lands of the west so close now, and the Horde having slaughtered and slain its way so far, fresh impetus and vigor filled the Horde as it crossed the Darklands in the shadow of the Ash Ridge Mountains, and all were driven before it. Tamurkhan's savage legend having become common currency amongst the misshapen Ghoul King, brutal Orcs, and predatory Hobgoblins that lived in the western Darklands. At the entrance to the wide pass, they were met by a full third of the strength of the Legion of Asgore, and the serried regiments of Infernal Guard waiting lockstep for them with Drazoath himself at their command, mounted upon a great burning beast like a winged bull. With them were drawn up strange iron and bronze engine caravans, half supply train, half war machine, driven forward by steam-hissing wheeled carriages they called Iron Demons. They were a bizarre and frightening sight to behold. They drove on to Death Pass, all but unopposed, its denizens skulking terrified in the shadows at the baleful sight of the great horde and the smoke-belching armored column that ran beside it. And so it was that in the dying of the summer of the year 2510 of the Imperial Reckoning, that like the wrath of a terrible and despoiling god, the horde of Tamurkhan fell upon the unprepared lands of the Border Princes. Life within the Border Princes is hard and full of danger, and yet the coming of the Chaos Horde of Tamurkhan was a disaster unlike anything these hard-scrabble lands had seen for centuries. After their long travail and the hardships that they had endured in the Darklands, the Kurgan, ogres, and foul beasts within the Horde looked upon the rolling green downs and tangled, verdant forest before them, and had never before seen a land so rich and ripe for despoil. They fell upon it like starving jackals set loose in a sheepfold. All but uncontrollable in their frenzy, the horde broke up almost at once into 1,000 independent bands that ravaged all before them like a wildfire, drowning one petty kingdom after another in its own blood, and leaving all barren and blasted in their wake. Great heaps of bodies mounded beneath grisly standards, where any had the temerity to stand before them, vastly outnumbered and outmatched even the largest and most military-capable alliance of the baronies and principalities, a so-called Confederation of the Eagle, whose army of skilled veteran mercenaries met the oncoming horde under the generalship of Leopold the Black, an infamous sellsword general of great renown, could not slow, let alone stop the horde. The human army, comprised of armored knights and well-disciplined pikemen, was crushed utterly, and the fleeing saviors ridden down by death-hungry Kurgan. Leopold being almost alone in escaping the field, albeit at the expense of his own troops' horrific demise. Restoring order in the host once they had broken up cost Tamurkhan and his chieftains valuable time, and meanwhile the Legion of Asgore, which had seen its own share of rich pickings and already began dispatching trains of captives and plunder back to the Darklands, proved infuriatingly difficult for Tamurkhan to hurry. Matters worsened as without warning hurricane storms rolled in from the mountains, driving sheets of rain that turned the downs into sodden quagmires of mud, while the voices of hungry spirits in the winds howled between the peals of thunder. Day after day the storm went on unabated, unnatural and horrific in its intensity, driving chimera and other fell creatures down from the heights to rip apart fleeing refugees and their pursuers. News reached Tamurkhan that Blackfire Pass was awash with a flood, and there was no way the land machines of the Chaos Dwarves could hope to attempt its crossing. Tamurkhan raged murderously, lashing out at his own followers and raving that he heard the laughter of the dark gods in the storm's voice. It was Lord Drazoath who unexpectedly provided a solution in collating such scorched books and blood-stained parchments as his forces had uncovered from their path of destruction. He had learned of a pass named in some texts as Winter's Teeth. Splintered and inhospitable, it was said to have been the site of dwarf mines and citadels long since abandoned, and the pass itself was all but forgotten. But it offered an alternative route further west that might allow them to cut up into the belly of the Empire from an unexpected quarter. The unnatural storm lessened in its intensity the further west they went, and when war parties sent to scout the pass vowed it was all but untouched by the havoc that had been raining down on them, Tamurkhan immediately seized upon it, and set the drums of the horde beating in frenzied motion. The acolytes of Nurgle answered the call keenly, but others did not. Many of the ever-superstitious Kurgan saw the unnatural storm as a sign of the dark god's disfavor. Others muttered yet that the lands westward lay open and ripe for the taking, and were yet untouched by the despoiling horde. Those champions who did not embrace the plague god demanded the omen's meaning. Sail through burning runes of prophecy across the lattices of boiling elf marrow. All the signs seemed to point to disaster and death. When informed of these omens, Drazoath merely smiled coldly and turned away, while Tamurkhan would have none of such predictions. His fate, his glory was but a handful of footsteps away. After all, Tamurkhan declared, the vanguard that breached the pass reported only some scatterings of resistance from black-cowled goblins that fled in the panic when confronted by Kurgan's bared blades. They had sent such weaklings to flight and slaughter many times before. Why should they fear them now? Once they'd reached the pass through the Black Mountains, the going grew easier, as the pass was far more level than one might have imagined. High above them, the peaks and rock faces were crowned with effigies of ancient dwarf ancestor god, heroes and runic inscriptions, weathered by time and the fury of the elements, but far from erased. Setting a brutal pace by midday, the foremost warriors soon found themselves marching through recently abandoned encampments and litter piles at the open mouths of caves, foul and unkempt. They showed clear signs of goblin-kind as their makers, and many of the campfires at their fore still smoked, and the stench of charred flesh hung upon the air. Further on, the Kurgan came across remains of their own kind, those riders who had scouted ahead of the horde and not returned. They passed the grisly, mutilated bodies of former comrades, staked or hung beside the path, where the pitiless greenskins had left them to be found, while heat cracked, human and horse bones littered throughout the campfires spoke of the fate of others. At these crude barbarities, the Kurgan laughed, for they honored the dark gods and had seen far worse in their time. Indeed, they had done worse themselves. The Chaos Dwarves were indifferent, their demeanor neither heightened nor dimmed by the findings. As for the ogres, the scent of burning flesh merely stirred their famous insatiable appetites, and made them only more impatient for battle. Soon enough, sporadic goblin raiding parties began to harass the horde, claiming the lives of those at the edges of the column and disappearing back into the darkness. As the hours progressed towards true nightfall, the horde's casualties started to mount, but Tamurkhan ordered the horde onward still. He would stand no delays, now he was so close to his prey, and pushed his host on until they had reached a point where the ancient maps they followed described a wide shoulder of the mountain, its surface hammered flat, where it might be possible for the horde to encamp with some measurement of cohesion and security before the sun's setting. So it was that after a day of almost continuous harassment, the forward column of the horde turned into the shadowed vale beneath the high peaks, and was faced by a vast sea of black cloth and leering green faces spread across the wide, stony expanse. Lurid banners flapping and snapping in the chill wind. The night goblins had waited for the Chaos Force to reach a point where there was room enough for its massed tribes to deploy their numbers. Not only did the greenskin battle line spread across the valley edge to edge, perhaps as much as a league across, behind it stretched a mass of shifting darkness as far as the eye could see. Shrouded by the setting sun, the immense forms of giants and hulking spiders the size of mill wheels, towering over the night goblins below them. As Tamurkhan fixed the foe with his ogre's cataract white eyes, he knew that many more night goblins were likely to be lurking in adjoining caverns and hidden dens within the peaks, ready to spring. For Tamurkhan knew night goblins were wicked and cowardly creatures that would not have dared bar his path, even in such numbers, unless the spite-filled war bosses that led them felt assured of some chance of victory. That they believed this was the case now, against so mighty and terrible a force as his host, spoke either of mass insanity on their part, or some dark scheme he could not yet pass. The night goblins did not attack immediately, but instead stamped and clashed their weapons, screaming and howling taunts from across the barren space, clearly waiting for the horde to make the first move. Tamurkhan used this pause to swiftly dispatch orders to his commanders and array his vanguard into battle order, sending word along the long line behind him that the battle was about to be joined, and warnings of imminent ambush. He summoned both Saul the Faithless and Kha'Zix the Befouled to his side, while Orbel flew high above the horde in an effort to gain the measure of their foe and any trickery they might have had planned. The Kurgan were eager to spill blood, however, and the tainted ogres more so, and soon, by order or not, the horde would make its assault and would not be held back, bridling as it was for carnage after long hours of being taunted and picked at by the night goblins hidden in the heights. No sooner had Kha'Zix's pestilent and reeking form reached his warlord's banner, and with Sarl yet far behind in the column of march, did Tamurkhan's own plague ogres break from the ranks and tumble headlong at the enemy, bellowing and frothing with rage. At the sight of this, a great roar went up from the horde, and scattered bands of Kurgan marauders joined the charge, along with a maddened pack of mutant warhounds, 60 strong, and fought loose of their keepers and leapt slavering at the foe, swiftly outpacing the plague ogres with their long loping strides. Knowing that the disordered charge would lead to disaster for the horde, Tamurkhan, roaring in rage, was forced to sound the general attack, the blaring cry of war mammoth tusk horns momentarily drowning out even the din of the Kurgan war cries. The mighty drums struck up in their wake, pounding a rapid beat, and the horde lurched forward, hoofbeats and thousands of heavy footfalls, echoing like the rolling peal of thunder and picking up great clouds of dust in the cold air. With the horsemen and hounds taking the lead, Tamurkhan himself led the center of the advance, surrounded by the rust and filth-spattered ranks of chaos warriors and a great fly swarm, an eternal accompaniment of the armies of Nurgle, rose before them like an angry cloud, casting a shadow across the valley floor. The great mass of the night goblin army wavered and rippled in fear at the sight of what confronted them. But they held together, jagged spear points leveled before them, partly supported by their own numbers and the prisoning rock walls to either side. With the advance halfway to the enemy, boulders and long spears and even more bizarrely ragged wing shapes, which proved to be screaming night goblins bound to crude winged harnesses, began to be flung wildly out at the chaos horde. Propelled by ramshackle contraptions hidden in the mass of the night goblins' rear ranks, many of these projectiles fell short or careened off the rock wall, but such was the number of the onrushing horde that many found their mark regardless of the greenskins' poor aim, and men and horses alike were brutally impaled, crushed to bloody pulp, or cut down by spinning fragments in their headlong charge. As the ground was closed by the horde, cloud after cloud of black-felched arrows went up from the night goblins, and the carnage in the pass was doubled, and suddenly intensified as shaman cast spells that began to crackle and spatter amongst the charging Kurgan. Curious green lights played upon the Chaos Marauders, and many were suddenly cast to the ground and crushed beneath the invisible weight of powerful magic. Their forces much thinned by the onslaught, the Kurgan slammed into the Night Goblin horde, and the entire black-clad mass seemed to shudder and quake as the line of battle quickly became a swirling melee of blood, dust, and iron, stabbing spear points and hacking axe blades, rising and falling in frenzied savagery. Insane spinning figures lurched clear of the crush, almost drunkenly carried along by the momentum of their blood-spattered weighted balls and chains. Tamurkhan's own sledgehammer column of Nurgle-blessed warriors thundered to the foe, and behind them more and more warriors were pouring into the gap the charging vanguard have left in their wake, for there were thousands more eager to do battle in the name of the Chaos Gods and prove themselves to their dark masters. Bubalos fell upon the night goblins with a cascade of rancid breath that momentarily stunned the greenskins and drove them back in terror. The Maggot Lord spurred his mount onward into the throng. Tamurkhan's blade swept out in swooping areas, cleaving heads from bodies, as Bubalus's jaws seized mouthfuls of his enemies and spat out their mangled corpses. Others, the toad dragon simply stepped on and crushed beneath his incomparable bulk, while Tamurkhan, gutted a mountain giant and yanked out a fistful of its innards as bloated carrion flies swarmed into its body, devouring it from within as it wailed its piteous death cry. Without warning, the mountains themselves shuddered as strange green lightning flashed high above the battle. An instant later, a colossal grinding sound vibrated through the fabric of the world, momentarily stilling the frenzied battle and causing beast, warrior, and greenskin alike to stumble and fall. High above, at the entrance to the valley, and at a dozen other narrow places along the pass, vast slabs of rock and ancient dwarf statuary, untouched by time, slowly shuddered into motion and began with almost galling slowness to slip from their foundation and tumble with cataclysmic force into the pass below. Hundreds were annihilated in the blinking of an eye, and within moments, the great serpent of the Chaos Horde had been severed into a dozen pieces, all writhing in shock at what had been wrought upon them. Vast billowing clouds of choking dust rolled through the pass, and scores of night goblins and brutish trolls emerged from their concealment in the wake of the earth-shaking attack that fell upon the horde, screeching and screaming in drug-induced madness and gnawing horror. Where there had once been a single great clash, now a dozen smaller battles were joined, split over mile after mile of the snaking pass. Tamurkhan's horde now faced its most dire trial yet. At the front of the horde, the great battle in the enclosed valley was beginning to turn, for even though the night goblins numbered in their tens of thousands and had cut off the head of Tamurkhan's horde from any help, they soon found that they had woefully underestimated the strength and savagery of the warriors of the northern wastes. Iron-shod hooves shattered skulls, and spear shafts and razor-edged blades of newly forged black steel from the furnaces of Zar cleft shields asunder and hacked apart, the night goblins cowering behind them as if they were no more than rag dolls. Footstep by bloody footstep, the night goblin throng was pushed back, the ground thick with bodies, as great wedges were thrust deep into the greenskin ranks, where the chosen warriors of chaos, tall and inviolable, and sheathed in otherworldly armor, contemptuously tore through the greenskins' embattled defense, like reapers scything down wheat. Panic and disorder started to ripple through the sable-shrouded mass, and those caught before the fury of Tamurkhan's horde tried to flee, but were prevented by the press of bodies behind them, only to be savaged by the ripping fangs of Chaos Warhounds as they attempted to run. The Night Goblin archers, and soon their slipshod war machines, began to fire into the very thick of the battle line in a desperate fear of their own lives as the Chaos forces pressed ever closer, killing as they came. And more often than not, the greenskins' shot and stone fell short, and their fire fell directly into the tightly packed greenskin ranks, and great showers of foul night goblin blood burst over the battlefield like rain. The panic became a rout, and those at the front of the battle abandoned their weapons as they clawed and scrambled over those behind in their efforts to escape. Even now, as the tide of battle turned, the greenskins were not entirely without guile or power, for hidden amongst their ranks were many vile and dangerous creatures, as well as shaman whose spells now began to fizz and spatter amongst the Kurgan line. Eerie green lights played upon the Chaos troops, and several dense knots of armored warriors were suddenly cast to the ground and crushed to gore-stained pulp beneath the invisible weight of powerful magic. The Horde's own sorcerers concealed in the ranks frantically wove their counterspells, but the magic of the greenskins was strange and elusive, and blasts of verdant energy fell upon the leading Chaos warrior bands like hammer blows. At the head of one great thrust of Nurgle's blessed warriors, which punched into the Night Goblin throng, was Tamurkhan himself. As he hacked and crushed his way forwards, Bubelos was struck again and again by sorcerous bolts that caused the beast to roar in pain. The onslaught of the Night Goblin magic left a strange bitter tang in the air that unsettled the great beast, and even the fly swarm that clustered about them drew high into the air to escape it. Tamurkhan's warband had almost reached to the very heart of the Night Goblin army, where beneath a blanket of woven darkness, an ancient and wizened Night Goblin shaman perched malevolently enthroned aback a giant albino spider, dredged up from the dark bowels of the earth, and armored with the bones of thousands of victims, lashed to the back of its carapace with flayed skin fetishes. Around the great corpse-pale spider flew the banner of the tribes who opposed Tamurkhan and claimed the Winter's Teeth Pass for their own. The Murder Grins and the Corpse Cutters and Empty Skulls and Dead Moons. On catching sight of his enemy, Tamurkhan lowered his great axe and bellowed a challenge, spurring on the decaying and nightmarish warriors that surrounded him onto greater heights of fury and destruction. Coiling fogs of glowing green vapor filled the air and drove the night goblins into a whirling frenzy, and they hurled themselves heedless into their enemies, only to be speared or beaten down beneath the crushing charge of Kha'Zix's rot knights, or smashed apart by the skull-headed flails of Nurgle's chosen. Sorcerer acolytes were swift to answer the Night Goblin's fog with infinitely more lethal magics of their own, and soon billowy yellow-black fumes descended upon the enemy, spreading baleful contagion and ugly death wherever it went. In the face of this horrific onslaught, the Night Goblin's counterattack first began to falter and then failed. Sensing that the end had come, the Night Goblin army fled in abject terror, and the Chaos Horde pursued. At the head of the fighting, Tamurkhan's axe rose and fell, carving a bloody path through all before him, as the greenskins scattered like mice before the harvest sickle. Bugbelos roared with all his might, and his rancid breath was a poisoned wind that choked the life out of the panicked night goblins. All was mayhem and confusion. In the eagerness, none held back, but gave full vent to their fury, so that the greenskins were pressed together into the valley's narrow exit, where their bodies were soon piled 10 deep, and their fellows clambered over them to be free from the wrath of chaos unleashed. Still, Tamurkhan did not stop, but drove on as the valley narrowed, pursuing the night goblins through the defile, his decaying disciples and blood-drenched bile trolls close behind. The great beast shoved aside the mound of corpses to reach their foes, but frustratingly, the great albino spider, now short a chitinous leg where one of Tamurkhan's plague spawn had ripped it free, and bleeding pink ichor from a dozen wounds, made its escape up the sheer rock face, the ancient shaman clinging desperately to its back, and disappeared behind a weathered statue and into the darkness. With their leader taken flight, the rout of the night goblins became an insane stampede to escape, and the victorious slaughter belonged to the horde. Elsewhere along the many winding miles of Winterteeth Pass, battles both great and small were fought, and in many the forces of chaos were triumphant. But in some places the night goblin ambush had proved more successful, and victory for the horde had only been bought at great cost. In others, Tamurkhan's followers had been wiped out completely, their bodies carried away into the darkness, so only blood-caked dust and shattered weapons remained to mark their passing to their surviving comrades. The horde encamped that night where it fought, surrounded by the burning pyres of the dead to light the darkness, sore and weary. No second attack came. The enemy had been spent, not only in numbers but in the will to resist. With the pale light of dawn came a war council. Fractious and bitter with recrimination, Tamurkhan imposed his will once more, although now, through outright threat and fear more than any sense of the Chaos God's promised glory or duty to him in the others. Only Kha'Zix, his ever-rotting flesh seeping through many fresh rents in his armor, stood foursquare with his leader without qualm or dissent. The greatest cause for trouble was not the ambush or the bloodshed of the previous day, but the need of labor in order to overcome the shattered rocks that had fallen to block the pass in a dozen places. Fighters still made up the bulk of the Horde's manpower, along with Tamurkhan's own sworn plague ogres, who would be the muscle and bow needed to accomplish the task. This rankled the proud warriors of the north, who saw such labor as the work of slaves, and flatly refused to be under the direction of Chaos Dwarves while doing so. Eventually, through threat of bloodily reprisal and dire necessity, was accommodation reached between them, and although none were happy with the arrangement, the crude ramps were built with piled debris for stones and pulped goblin flesh for mortar, and the Horde once more struggled into life and movement. Resentment simmered on within the ranks where all should have been eager for battle, their final goal at last in sight. But Tamurkhan cared not for this, for the throne of chaos was nearly in his grasp. It was nearly a full moon's turning before the greater bulk of Tamurkhan's horde was able to ascend from the Black Mountains and into the lands of Sigmar's empire. Tamurkhan had changed over the course of the journey, now appearing even more infected and oozing than he had before, in a manner which pleased the followers of Nurgle that attended him, but to those not of his faith made him even less human, both in aspect and in mind, and ever more difficult to deal with. It was left then to Sile the Faithless, still half crippled himself but slowly recovering his strength, to listen carefully to reports of all the raider bands as they returned to piece together what lay before them. Whilst captives lived, he oversaw the work of their tortures, and when they died, Sile watched as the shaman bound their spirits and continued to question them long into the night. He inspected the weapons of war the raiders brought back as trophies, and bid the hellsmiths of the Black Fortress examine the arms and armor of the enemy with all their considerable expertise, of which they took a special interest in the few firearms taken by the Chaos Marauders. By these means, Sile learned all he could of the enemy's capabilities and of the lands of the Empire before them. Conveying what he could to Tamurkhan, Tamurkhan decided to split his army into three. The Chaos Dwarves, led by Lord Drazoath, took the route along the river, smashing a series of petty towers and keeps that had been espied along the way. It was the only narrow but serviceable roadway, a remnant of the days, centuries before, when this land was far more populated and trade strong. This route's more passable terrain being the most suited for the use of the Chaos Dwarf war machine trains. All would depend on speed, for it was clear that surprise was lost to them. Some survivor of the destruction they had wrought in the Border Princes had somehow survived to tell of the Horde. But if fortune favored them, the Empire would still be slow to rally its full might to counter a massive attack from this unexpected quarter. Drazoath and the Horde moved quickly through the Empire's lands. The rapid pace of the advance took its toll upon machines and beasts, and the wake of wreckage and corpses lay strewn behind the route of the march. Here and there, the lone parties of Chaos Dwarves grappled with broken-down engines, bent drive shafts, and shattered wheels, while the Kurgan abandoned the weak and the dead at will. The beasts of chaos devoured any that fell to assuage their hunger. Outriders roamed far to the north and reported that the land northward was now deserted, save for a flurry of activity around the great city. And such was Tamurkhan's rage on finding the town of Gunnertag utterly deserted and left aflame, when days before, Orbal Vipergut had reported a stalwart defense prepared. The Maggot Lord ordered the flames extinguished and the land foully defaced and desecrated in honor of Nurgle. It was here that the Horde once again came together for the final assault. 21 days after breaking their camp at the foot of the Black Mountains, the Chaos Horde beheld the white-towered city. The Kurgan regarded its high walls and stern defenses, and knew that whole armies might break upon such fortifications. They towered so high that not even a giant might scale them unaided. Tamurkhan brought the Lord of the Black Fortress before him, and bid him speak to the matter. After all, Why else had the dwarves of Zard dragged their machines and great siege mortars halfway across the world, if not to topple fortifications such as these? Drazoath laughed. Walls, he scorned. I see only piles of sand, crafted by children. Bring my brothers close enough, and we shall take pleasure in fulfilling our bargain and topple them for you. The Chaos Horde arrayed themselves for battle, 5 leagues due south of the great city, and marched towards their goal. Tamurkhan rode up and down the lines of troops aback his toad dragon, bellowing and exhortating them to fight with utmost savagery, for the dark gods were watching. Wherever he went, he was greeted by war cries, the unearthly howl of beasts, vile oaths, and the hammering of blade on shield. For now, at last, the Kurgan would see battle. Not battle against the cursed greenskins, such as they had fought at Winter's Teeth Pass, but battle against the men of the Empire. The Emperor's army had taken up position before the city walls on a low palisaded rise, with cannon arrayed across its front, as well as on the walls above, so to maximize its firepower. The mass of the opposing army standing behind the cannon line, with ranks of spearmen and gunners set to receive the Horde's charge, while providing room for swift withdrawal should the Chaos Horde press too close. Tamurkhan knew well the stories of the battles and warlords that had gone before him, and knew that the cannon of the Empire were to be feared as much as those of the dwarves of Zar. The weaponry of the Empire's soldiers shone brightly in contrast to the black and scoured armor of the Kurgan, and the tainted and sickly greenish metal that adorned his own followers. Tamurkhan grinned lopsidedly with the great degenerate wound his mouth had become, for his enemy had already made a fatal error. They had arrayed for battle expecting a headlong charge, which they might cut down with their guns. But he had brought guns of his own. Brought up to a halt just beyond the range of the enemy's cannon, a handful of which cracked and spattered up mud and soil before them impotently. Once all was ready, Tamurkhan raised his colossal axe high and let it fall. The signal was given. The battle was opened with a deafening roar. The brazen and black iron vessels of destruction began the battle. Eerily glowing projectiles arcing up through the dense mist soon began to fall with frightening accuracy down on the closely packed Empire batteries behind the outer palisade. The explosion of the Chaos Dwarfs' Dreadquake mortar shells, filled as they were with powerful alchemical explosive, was devastating. Great plumes of flames lanced upwards as the explosive force shredded men and cannon with equal ease, shaking the ground itself. As a wave of destruction rippled through the enemy, and confusion and horror broke out in the ranks, a great bloodthirsty cry went up from the Horde, and in an instant, the great mass leapt forward as one. Dolgan horsemen and Kurgan knights surged forward, twisting hounds braying at their heels, and behind them came roiling spawn and thunder-footed ogres and trolls, an unholy mass of hate and muscle, bent only on slaughter. What followed was a shockingly quick descent into madness and death. Cannon roared on both sides, and men and beasts were torn apart. Rather than stand and die before the onslaught, a wedged column of armed knights broke forward in countercharge, while behind them regiments held their ground stonily, while panicked militia cowered in terror or tried to flee back through the city gates. The skies above blackened with swarms of flies, and resounded to the doom-laden wing beats of dragons and chimera, which dissented to smote cannon from atop the high walls and rampaged through the city streets. Horsemen from both sides clashed over the open ground between the two armies. Black-armored Kurgan Chaos Knights fought against glistening Reichsguard, each charging through the rank of the other and turning to charge again. Around them swirled a loose mass of lightly armed cavalry, the marauders of the wastes on one side, the Empire Pistoliers on the other. The crack of the Empire's horsemen's pistols carried above the shouts and trumpet blasts. Behind the advancing horde came the gun carriages of the Chaos Dwarves, hauled slowly forward by the smoke-belching iron demon engines. They unleashed a steady, creeping barrage on the foe, keeping their fire ahead of the battle line until the walls and towers shook with their wrath and burst aflame one after the other. The cavalry battle proved brutal and short, with the Empire's forces wildly outnumbered, soon overwhelmed and scattered, and with a mighty roar, the whole Chaos Horde surged forward and crashed, like a tidal wave, into the outer palisade. As the Empire forces tried to sound a general retreat behind the walls, shells and fireballs fell before the gate, forcing those who would flee to run a gauntlet of death, while those who survived on the battlements above rained down handgun shot and crossbow bolts with frantic desperation in the hope of slowing the unstoppable tide. There was an almighty blast as a dozen hellish war engines spoke at once, and the great portcullis gate of the city, even then as it began to draw closed, exploded in a river of fire and disintegrated slowly into rubble. Its ponderous collapse, dragging wall towers to ruin around it, and crushing hundreds in their death throes. The Horde's warriors, all but knocked flat by the thunderclap and rush of hot air, howled in triumph, while the soldiers of the Empire screamed hopelessly, their spirits broken. Hook-handed giants scrambled over the debris, dragging huge lengths of chains behind them, tearing cannon and mortars down from the walls, and serving in death as scaling ladders for hundreds of screaming fighters following behind. Plague ogres smashed and slashed their way through desperate pockets of defenders and fell ravenously on the bodies. The dust-filled sky darkened to an unnatural twilight, riven with screaming incendiary rockets, casting a lurid glow over the carnage, as the horde of the Maggot Lord poured into the city, insane with the joy of battle. Bubalos smashed a way clear through friend and foe alike in the anarchy at the shattered gate, and bore Tamurkhan into the city proper, where he bellowed fruitless challenges to his enemy to come forth and face him through the empty streets. Above all else, he desired to slay this emperor of men, if he be here, for there could be no more fitting a sacrifice to the dark gods than the crushed and lifeless body of Sigmar's heir. But the tangled streets and windswept market squares were deserted and lifeless. Doors hung open, sprawling litter and detritus of abandoned lives lay strewn about, and all was abandoned. Tamurkhan laughed aloud. The cowards had fled their vaunted city, and left their soldiers to die for them in their stead. Truly, these weaklings deserve no more than the death and slavery the Kurgan brought, and with it, Father Nurgle's special blessings. Caught between frustration at the scarcity of victims within the walls and the jubilation at their capture of the city, the warriors of the Horde tore through the empty streets and houses, destroying and burning. Within hours, vast sections of the city were ablaze or torn bodily into ruins. At last, as the city fell around him, Tamurkhan found a high and ornate temple bearing the twin-tailed comet emblem of Sigmar, lit in the blackness of the fallen night by flickering fires of destruction, just as he had seen in his visions, and he entered within. Others of the Horde had found it first, and already its statuary had been cast down and shattered, its stained glass windows smashed, and a heap of fresh body parts now profaned its high altar. Here Tamurkhan stood and howled in triumph to the dark skies beyond. Again and again he called upon his god Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, but was greeted only with silence. Tamurkhan turned from the defiled altar, reeling in confusion and sick with fury. Why did the gods refuse to answer him? Saul the Faithless had followed Tamurkhan into the temple and stood silently waiting in the shadows. "Why, Saul? Why will they not answer me? I have brought my master victory." Tamurkhan slurred through his ravaged features. "I have given Lord Nurgle the city of Magnus. It dies this night." Saul said nothing, but held out his still human-like left hand and let a golden chain dangle from his grasp. Glimmering in the reflected firelight from outside, a large and ornate seal flashed at the end of the chain. Enraged by this riddle, Tamurkhan bounded sluggishly down from the altar, fetid entrails slapping noisily from his open gut. He raised his axe above his head to strike down the sorcerer, but Saul stood before him unflinching. Tamurkhan wavered uncertainly and snatched the offered trinket, holding it up to his cataract-white eyes. On one side was the hated symbol of the twin-tailed comet, and on the other, the image of a citadel before a blazing sun. There was a word graven on it, but to him the letterwork of the Empire held as much meaning as chicken scratches in the dirt. Seeing the Maggot Lord's confusion, Saul whispered a single word of explanation, his voice a mocking whisper. "Faldorf." Slowly, realization bloomed in the decaying matter of his brain, and Tamurkhan howled so loudly that the larynx of his stolen body ruptured in his throat, and reeling almost drunkenly away from Saul, with a single sweep of his axe, cleft the profane altar of stone in two. The Faithless faded into the shadows and left Tamurkhan amid the ashes of his hollow victory. The city burned. Tamurkhan's rage had been such that he ordered the city of Faldorf laid waste, and the Legion of Asgore had been happy to comply, showering the gambrel-roofed tower houses and warrens of narrow streets with incendiaries until the ruins blazed in a great conflagration. The pall of smoke from the burning city was clearly visible from many leagues away in the wavering light of the following dawn, so even from the high battlements, from Nullen's outer curtain walls, Faldorf's dark fate was unquestionable. Within the Horde's ranks, the festering sore of discontent had swept out violence and distrust as the truth that their target had not been the desired one became known. Those who favored differing masters succumbed to infighting, scorn, and recrimination, although many in truth did not care whose blood they spilled or what walls they tumbled, so long as they had a chance to deal death and destruction in the sight of the gods. It was rather the fact that Tamurkhan had been in error, that he had been made to look fate's fool. That was the cause of the acrimony and foreboding, for the warriors of the Northlands and the servants of chaos both despise weakness, and some saw it in the cruel humor of the gods themselves, directed at Tamurkhan. Hundreds died as the malcontent of the Horde bore fruit over the following days, and fissures opened up within its unity, such as it was, until it began to split along divisions of race and dark fate, while Tamurkhan himself retreated within the private circle of Nurgle followers, burying himself for days in foul rituals of appeasement and propitiation to his master, the Lord of Decay. The Chaos Dwarves under Drazoath showed great displeasure that they had expended valued munitions and machinery against the wrong target, and demanded recompense. And while Tamurkhan was sequestered in foul ritual, perhaps surprisingly, it was Saul the Faithless who stepped into the breach of leadership and offered them the right to a victim of their own, the fortified town of Dakarus, to the northwest, to keep them occupied, to besiege and despoil unimpeded as they saw fit. This they did with swiftness and brutal efficiency. It took an attempt on Tamurkhan's life to rouse the Chaos Lord from his filth-tainted reverie. Unseen, silent, and shrouded by subtle magics, the lone assassin had stalked through the cinders and scorched ruins of Fyldorf to the noisome encampment the Maggot Lord's closest acolytes had made in the broken and burned remnants of Sigmar's temple that now jutted from the ruins like a cracked ribcage. Here, 1,000 rotting bodies had been heaped upon a great pit dug into the crypts below, their necromantic juices seeping into the carrion earth to form a sluice of surpassing foulness in which demonic things crawled, and Tamurkhan himself bathed in the befouled darkness. Knowing that it could not remain unnoticed despite the spell weavings around it, upon stalking closer to the mouth of the corpse pit, the assassin threw off its coverings and leapt burning into the abyss below. Lightning poured from its eyes and mouth, and its outline flickered and blurred out of step from the world around it like a phantasm. It struck the black waters with a thunderous discharge of power and the hiss of boiling ooze. The foul gases that filled the crypt igniting in unearthly waves of green and amber flame at the touch of the assassin's shivering skin. Blackened sword blades dancing with witchfire licked out with impossible speed as the assassin flickered through the black water, slicing and burning the bloated flesh of hulking demon plague toads that rose up against it. A bile troll came howling from the darkness, its long boneless arms reaching out to claim the assassin, but it was too slow, and the burning blade plunged into each of its eye sockets as the assassin spun on past it, knowing it had to reach its quarry before it was too late, and it was overwhelmed by the nightmarish forces which filled the crypt. The assassin sped along a line of stone crypts half submerged in the reeking waters, ever closer to the heart of darkness, when its quarry came instead to it, as Tamurkhan, more bloated and terrible than ever in aspect, came roaring from the darkness, trailing a miasma of sickening fog in his wake. A fist like a battering ram came flying towards the assassin, and it barely dodged aside in time, as the stone statue from some forgotten priest shattered under the blow instead. The blackened blades danced out, lightning arced, and rotting flesh burned. Tamurkhan laughed a hideous, gurgling sound in his ruined throat as the blades sank into his swollen flesh, which pulsed obscenely around them and scarred shut, trapping the swords, and a backhanded blow from the Maggot Lord sent the assassin tumbling away into the black waters. The assassin resurfaced moments later, power burning bright within it, showing the outlines of its skull and bones through flesh grown translucent with the blue-white flame from within, gathering all of its power for a desperate final attack. The Maggot Lord did not give it the chance, smashing the stone lid of a sarcophagus across the assassin like an oversized club, shattering stone and the body it struck. A thunderclap erupting through the crypt. Like a broken doll, the assassin once more struggled to rise from the black waters. But it was not alone in the foul wash, and long bony fingers grasped at it. Baleful eyes glimmered in the filth, and leering greens met its final struggles with savage mirth. After Nurgle's Tallyman and their pets had had their way with the assassin, Tamurkhan looked over the remains, with eyes now a blind cataract white, and glowing like marsh lights. Spell-stitched and soulless, his would-be killer had been bound up with the power burning it away from within. His enemies had drawn their plans and hidden their tracks well, a body too damaged for him to possess should he have needed to, and with no spirit for his shaman and sorcerer to torture into confession, only a near-mindless animating force woven from the winds of magic, driven to kill and know nothing more. Who had sent it? The battle wizards of the Empire, or a dark master closer to home, a would-be usurper of his lordship, perhaps? It did not matter to Tamurkhan. It was no longer important. The thing that dragged its way out of the pits was far removed from the ogre tyrant the Maggot Lord had possessed in the Mountains of Morn. The creature's body had rotted further, swelled larger yet, and was twisting into a mockery of life in death. The stigmata of Nurgle writ clearly upon it. Around it hung the reek of the grave and the murmurous voice of flies, and all those of Nurgle's faith who saw it fell to their knees, rededicated themselves afresh to their master, so clearly now on the edge of apotheosis. For Tamurkhan, the throne of chaos was at hand. Tamurkhan was no longer capable of mortal speech, but his words could be discerned well enough by the acolytes around him in the maddening drone of the corpse flies that fed off their master. And as a bleak procession of tainted demon kind followed him up from the black pit, scores of inhuman things leering and cavorting on palsied limbs, the Maggot Lord's meaning was clear. The hour had come, and Nuln would know the wrath of chaos. And so the horde marched on the city of Magnus the Pious. And as they arrayed, facing the mighty city, at the center of the chaos battle line was the Maggot Lord himself, riding aback the toad dragon Bublos. The great beast cowed somewhat by what its master had become. The foul miasma that poured in brackish floods like ochre-black fog from Tamurkhan's body, a heady elixir for the devotees of the plague god who clustered around him. In his train came the remnants of the followers, the champions and warriors who had been his boon champions and acolytes since the battlefield of Zanbijin, which for them seemed like a lifetime ago. Many of them now transformed beyond all recognition by the blessings and afflictions of their corrupt patron. With them came a fresh coterie of Nurgle's demons, plague riders and talisman, half-formed slug-like nightmares, and chittering royals of foul Nurglings. At the flanks of this corps of retainers came those who enjoyed the Maggot Lord's favor, packs of hungering bile trolls, decaying chaos spawn, brute warbands of plague ogres, and the rusted and mouldering armored hulks of Kha'Zix the Befouled's rot knights. Trailing behind and not too close, lest the Lord of Decay's touch caress them, came the mass of the horde in their thousands. 100 petty warbands and subhuman detritus of chaos, the lost and the damned, mutants and rabble, the half-starved remnants of the Bray herd, chained siege giants, and monstrous beasts and nameless creatures of chaos that yet lived to be swept on in Tamurkhan's wake. Far away on the horde's left flank, following the banks of the Upper Reich, came a second shadow army. A sea of dark riders, chaos knights and Kurgan marauders, Dolgan Khans and Wastelander wagon altars draped with skins and flesh. At its center rode Saul the Faithless, atop a carved throne of ivory borne on the back of a sacred war mammoth, one of only a dozen that had survived the long trek to this final battle. It was Saul now those Kurgan who did not share Tamurkhan's faith looked to for leadership and direction, and to interpret the signs of the gods of chaos. The Chaos Dwarves were last to arrive from their newly established base of the Carhouse, the burning wing shape of Cinderbreath, Lord Drazoath's mount circling low overhead. The day of destruction was born slowly, pale mists clinging to the damp earth, and 1,000 breathless prayers were offered up to the gods of mankind and screamed in exultation to the lords of ruin. The sun rose up like a bloody beacon to light the way, and the battle was joined. Tamurkhan had entrusted Saul the Faithless to take the left flank, the Chaos Dwarves taking up artillery positions not too far behind them. Tamurkhan and his faithful retinue would take the center, while the beasts, mutants, and creatures that did not follow his faith would be hurled into the right flank of the Empire position. The Empire's forward battery spoke first, wasting no time. They hurled rapid volleys of cannon fire into the advancing mass of Tamurkhan's vanguard at extreme range. These long-barreled cannon, lighter than their counterparts at the center of the Empire lines, but still as deadly, and against so great a target, they could scarcely fail to find their mark. Bodies of men and beasts were torn asunder by the steady bombardment, but the horde carried on, without fear or regard, its ranks seeming never to falter, as shot after shot was poured from the soon red-hot cannon. Closer and closer came the horde, and soon the state troops arrayed in the defensive squares could begin to see the true horror of the foe that had come to claim their lives. In the center of the Empire's line, a huge fireball suddenly soared high into the air, before seeming to hang, immobile in the sky like a second sun. Then, at last, it began the inevitable fall to earth. The plunging missile blazed so brightly that the whole army of the Empire was bathed in its angry light. The ranks faltered for a moment, but then the fiery orb struck the ground with a mighty crash, erupting into a ball of all-consuming flame. The whole battlefield felt the impact, and troops from both sides clung to weapons that shook in their hands. Horses bucked, and their riders struggled to hold them. So it was that the Legion of Asgore announced their presence. The fiery invocation had come from the center of a great iron-caged pyre, mounted on the back of an iron-wheeled altar so large it needed to be pulled by 3 iron demon engines. And around it Chaos Dwarves swarmed with uncanny and unnerving position, forming a diamond-shaped deployment at the edge of cannon range from the levee defense lines of the Empire troops, quickly setting up fire positions with their snaking war machine trains, whose clanking and hellish hissing cries could be heard clear to the city walls. Each side aimed to destroy the artillery of the other. The Imperial army possessed many more cannons than the Chaos Dwarves, but at such long range, only the largest guns had enough reach to strike back at the Chaos Dwarves' position. And so, most were forced instead to try and thin the ranks of the Horde as best they could before the inevitable and unholy charge. The death toll on both sides was hideous, and once the skilled gunners of the famous Nuln Artillery School found their range, they dropped fire accurately into the Chaos Dwarf positions. One shot carried away an ogre loader who burst apart, showering the Hellsmith artillerymen with the creature's toxic innards. Another cannonball landed into a caisson of mortar bombs and ripped a gash into the earth with an explosive blast which shook the ground for a league around and sent Infernal Guard flying into the air like scattered toys. Chaos Dwarf-made weapons were designed for the slow pace of siege warfare, and their missiles were time-consuming to prime and cumbersome to load. For every shell that hurled towards the opposing ranks, 100 cannonballs spun and bounced towards the Horde. But despite this, they accounted for themselves with lethal force. The firepower of the Chaos Dwarf weapons was suffused with all manner of horrific and demonic force from the great gouts of screaming power that devoured everything it struck, to bolts of molten metal hurled like blazing arrows across the field, and eldritch rockets, which exploded their wrath high in the air to see it race down screaming with diabolical intelligence to hungrily burn the flesh of its victims. Every missile the Chaos Dwarf loosed towards the enemy inflicted intolerable damage. Cannon after cannon disappeared beneath a ball of flame, and soon the front ranks of the Imperial army were in visible disarray, although they held fast, their banners high in defiance. The lines closed. Crossbow bolts shivered through the air. Hideous war cries went up from both sides as the bravery of mortal men held fast to confront an army of inhuman horror and unquenchable bloodlust that hammered towards it. At 200 paces, the Empire handgunners opened fire, a snarling crackle of flame and smoke suddenly shrouding the defenders' lines, and a wave of bodies fell from the horde into the dirt, cut down as before a reaper's scythe. But the hideous creatures and mutated warriors of Tamurkhan came on unchecked, clambering over the bodies of their fallen. Close now, the horde broke up. The longer gait of the huge bile trolls and multi-limbed chaos spawn running ahead of the pack in their frenzied desire to destroy, while the demon tallymen of Nurgle droned on maddeningly, counting out a litany of the slain, while festering clouds of blood-hungry flies swarmed towards the men of the Empire from the decaying ranks of Nurgle's children, as thick as cloying fog. Meanwhile, high above the battlefield, the Chaos Dragon Rider, Orbal Vipergut, led a force of carrion, vulture-winged demons, tainted harpies, and leather-winged manticore to darken the skies, only to be met in rushing, screaming combat by white-winged griffin-riding knights and a trinity of fire wizards mounted atop a burning wheel of fire and coal-black iron, while all around them the air was rent with shrieking rockets, arcane blasts, and whistling shells. The blood fell like misted rain as they clashed. Below, Kha'Zix the Befouled cantered at the head of his Rot Knights, forming the honor guard which rode in front of their master Tamurkhan. The ground between the armies was now so loose and pitted that the pace of the heavy Chaos Riders was reduced. But sluggish progress mattered little now that the Empire's guns had been largely silenced. In front of them, the enemy infantry tightened their formation to withstand the charge, as the first of the beasts that ran ahead of the horde ravaged into their lines. Closing ranks to stand shoulder to shoulder, those in front braced their halberds against their right foot and readied their swords grimly to receive the charge. And Kha'Zix smiled wetly at their folly and false hope that they could withstand the death that closed in on them. At 100 paces, a hail of arrows and bullets flew from behind the halberdiers, arching upwards and then down upon the Chaos Knights, but most rattled uselessly against the rusted and slime-coated armor of the Rot Knights, and bounced harmlessly from the heavy plates that protected their mounts. Only here and there did missiles find their mark, piercing the wearer's armor at a joint, or perhaps finding some spot weakened too far by corrosion and canker. A few riders tumbled to the ground, and horses fell screaming, but the horsemen of pestilence rode on relentlessly. The Chaos Knights leveled their cruelly barbed lances and charged, their hellish gaunt steeds foaming black at the mouth with savage effort. 100 paces distance became 50, and 50 10, when unexpectedly the front ranks of the enemy peeled away in desperate flight, revealing a trio of squat multi-barreled iron cannon chased in gleaming bronze. It would have been too late to abort their charge even if they'd wished, and in the bleak joy of their tainted existence, the Rot Knights cared not for the danger, as the Hellblaster volley gun erupted in sheets of flame from their spinning muzzles. Each barrel discharged its load of a dozen or more small cannonballs. They cut a swathe through the armored knights and opened great gaps in the Chaos ranks. Those who survived the cannon fire plunged straight into the enemy infantry. In places, the valiant footmen held their ground, but in others they were scattered or cut down. Those Rot Knights mounted upon their monstrous steeds had little difficulty overcoming the fence of gleaming halberds raised before them. Chaos-bred mounts crashed down upon poor infantrymen, crushing the leading ranks and slashing those behind with steel-sharp hooves, as riders impaled men bodily one to another with their lances in screaming slaughter, and lay about themselves with festering, skull-headed flails, which champed and bit with venom-dripping teeth. But even where the Imperial regiments broke and fled, others quickly took their place as the second line advanced. Soon, even the most deadly of Chaos Knights and rampaging spawn at the fore of the fighting found themselves outnumbered and surrounded by glittering spear points and blood-stained blades. But just as the tide appeared to turn, with a deafening bellow, Bubelos the Toad Dragon and its terrible master entered the fray, with mutated giants and great plague demon things at his heels. Flesh liquefied before the Toad Dragon's foul breath, and scores of men fell screaming as terrible diseases and afflictions erupted without warning, kindling like fire in their flesh as the demons of Nurgle drew close. Swift-footed beastmen came screaming from behind the tide of monsters, falling with animal savagery on the wounded and the isolated in a welter of blood. Then came the sound of trumpet blasts and the roaring thunder of hooves from the east, loud enough to drown out even the clangor of the bloody battle, and soon the ground itself shook and vibrated in omen at what was to come. At the sound, Tamurkhan reared up his toad dragon and looked across the swirling slaughter around him, and saw a great wall of shining steel rushing towards them like a foaming wave. Banners of black, gold, grey, and scarlet, snapping and flying above the knights of a dozen orders. Lance points levelled in a glittering wall of promised death. The fetid Lord of Nurgle spurned Bubelos, who let out a deafening cry of its own, and turned to countercharge the new threat. The Maggot Lord swinging around his great axe in wild demand for the horde to follow. Now it was the turn of the horde to feel the keen-edged blades of their enemy and withstand the hurricane force of the knights' mass charge. The shock of the Empire cavalry's impact sundered into the horde, which fractured but did not break before the onslaught. It was those humanoid warriors on foot, the whirling marauders, howling beastmen, and degenerate mutants that took the worst of the blow and died in their hundreds in the first moments as the glittering column of steel and vengeful ire slammed into the melee. But they were not alone, and even hulking plague ogres clad in Chaos Dwarf-forged black metal fell in scores, pierced in a dozen places by the lances of the knights. Behind the first arrowhead wave of knights came a second charge of free riders and pistoliers, who darted through the melee seeking targets of their own, discharging wheel-lock guns into towering monstrosities at point-blank range, or hurling demi-lances into the backs of hulking chaos warriors already caught up in savage combat, little caring if a few of their fellow soldiers were struck in the process. Here and there, the actinic flashes of magic revealed the presence of battle wizards in the thundering charge, as searing blasts of pure white light burned into the rancid flesh of Nurgle's demon tallymen, scorching them into oblivion, while a vast tangle of murderous living fawns erupted from the earth, catching a clutch of festering bile trolls in their deadly embrace, and try as they might, the hulking monsters could not break free, and only managed to rend and puncture their ever-knitting flesh over and over again in the attempt. Soon enough, the warring forces became hopelessly interpenetrated, and the impetus of the charge was completely lost as the knights and free riders became mired in countless separate hand-to-hand struggles. The savage axes of the Chaos Warriors were turned on the new foe, cutting down rider and horse alike with their inhuman strength. And soon the bloated beasts of Nurgle were pulling knights from their mounts and even picking up horses, riders, all before crushing and rendering them in their tentacled grasps. A great bone-grinder giant, taller than a watchtower, its pale flesh mutilated by masses of weeping sores, strode over a battery palisade, began to pick up a great cannon there, and flung them towards the oncoming Empire cavalry, as easily as a boy might hurl stones at skittles. The carnage the flying metal caused on the onrushing knights was abruptly ended when the giant toppled screaming to the ground, as the wound-crazed griffin, a riderless and bloody saddle trailing behind behind it slammed like a cannonball into its chest, and powered away with a whooshing wing beats, taking what was left of the giant's face with it, as red tatters trailed from its gleaming claws. Where there had been the central defense line of the Empire forces was now a vast, whirling melee miles across. An orderless, leaderless slaughter on a nightmarish scale where no quarter was given, and the screams of the dying hung in the air, echoing as far as the streets of the great city, where refugees huddled in fear at the sound. The ground, already a morass of blood and mud, became a quagmire of gore and twitching bodies. Both sides knew instinctively that whoever won this deadly gauntlet would win the day, and more reinforcements from both sides were fed into this vortex of blood, and the skies above grew black and turbulent, as if the sun refused to look upon the horror visited below. As the day waned, the bloody stalemate drew on, with no sure victory in sight for either side, who fought desperately on, with thousands now left dead at their feet. Tamurkhan broke free of the battlefront, and Bubulus, now bearing the scars of a score of weeping wounds, lance points jutting from its armored scales, limping as its rear limb had been struck by a fireball, and charred its knee down to blackened bone. The Maggot Lord's mind, half insane with the unbridled savagery of the day and the reek of carnage around him, still grasped that by simple attrition the Empire would eventually win as matters stood, and perhaps had already slain enough of his forces so that they had not enough strength to breach the city's defenses. Enraged beyond measure, he called to him his commanders, mortal and demon alike, to answer for the failure. Where were the Kurgan riders? Why had they not joined the fray? And with his own eyes he could see the plumes of black smoke from the Chaos Dwarf war machine trains withdrawing from the field. Did they believe their work was done? Nurgle take them. Tamurkhan listened aghast to reports that the Kurgan riders had fled from the field to scatter across the rolling hills behind, and choked with mounting fury at the realization that victory was being staunched away from him. All was lost. The throne of chaos, so tantalizingly close, was being snatched away from his grasp. And yet, the demons whispered in his mind, there was perhaps another way. As twilight fell on the great field of slaughter, the battle finally ebbed away. Tamurkhan had ordered the acolytes of the plague god to break off their assault, leaving only a few insane and uncontrollable monsters to fight on in their stead, the rest falling back into the gathering gloom. Behind them, they left the survivors of the Empire armies numb and exhausted, and in no fit state to mount any kind of pursuit, even if they'd wished it. The death toll had been staggering, and no right accounting could easily be given of the losses. The air was heavy with the reek of rotting blood and bodily corruption, and to Tamurkhan it was well and good as he mounted the shattered steps of the marble wellhead. The freshly defiled ruin that had once been an abbey, devoted to the pathetic goddess of healing, the squealing men of the empire called Shalia, the entrails of her clergy freshly smeared on its walls. He had been wrong. He understood that now. His thinking, this lust for paltry conquest, all had been wrong. His desires, petty, mortal. Decay cared not for the baubles of victory or the trinkets of kingship. His was the silence of the grave, the murmuring voices of flies, the wisdom of the cankerworm, and his prayer was the dying, tainted breath of a plague-racked body. Now Tamurkhan would take this empire of men and remake it into a shape more pleasing to his master. Death and decay were all. The battle had served its true purpose. Now 10,000 more bodies lay rotting, scattered across the earth, and had given him the power to work this dark malevolence. It was never enough, though. All must die. He had sent out his followers to slay and die in Nurgle's name in the night. He had unleashed all of his beasts of war, as aimless and indiscriminate as miasma on the wind. And distantly at the car house, the treacherous Chaos Dwarves had unleashed their fires in a vain effort to survive the vengeful assault of Kha'Zix and the Chosen, while winged carrion things now harried the horsemen that had sworn to serve him long ago in the wastes. He had taken the life of his faithful servant Bubulus with his own hands, opening its throat with his great axe and letting the black blood soak into the earth and fester. He was shriven now of all the ties of his mortal past. Tamurkhan staggered down into the waters of the sacred wellhead and upended the black amphora of contagion over himself, grinning as at its touch diseased flesh sloughed liquidly from his distorted bones under the caress of the filthy waters of Nurgle's domain. The water immediately began to boil and twist. The wind rose and fell and rose again until it became an unending howl of despair. The ground shook in surly protest. Trees swayed in agony beneath the wind's restless battering, while the waters of the river churned as if trying to flee the bondage of its banks. But nothing could escape from the grip of the curse Tamurkhan had wrought, not even the earth itself. An oily slick spread over the waters, which congealed and thickened in seconds, and the skies were racked by peals of thunder and flashes of lurid green lightning. From bank to bank, no water stirred beneath the maelstrom, for all had curdled to bubbling sludge and slime, the stain spreading across the waters with nightmarish speed. Dark and hideous forms shifted and began to drag themselves up from the slime, and from the shadows of the desecrated Abbey, drone-voiced demon tallymen shambled forward to greet the tide of their foul kin, erupting in scores from the beyond. Tamurkhan struggled up, his wrecked ogre body bloating and distended, the maggot worm within shuddering and pulsating. There was very little left of mortal flesh, however tainted within him now. And when the demon stain flowed as far as the great city, and the countless legions of plague brought death to its streets, there would be nothing mortal left of him at all, and he would be as they, reveling in corruption and despair for all eternity, rot without end. A sudden flash of purple-white fire flared on the landward edge of the Abbey compound, throwing into sharp relief the teeming multitude of hellish twisted flesh dragging itself out of the river. Tamurkhan snarled. They would not stop him. Not now. A ragged column of knights emerged from nowhere and launched an attack spearheaded by a huge man riding a savage demigryph. Tamurkhan ordered his demon forces forward. Nothing would stop his ascension now. Demons savagely tore at knights. Fetid claws gutted warhorses, dragging them down. But even as they died, the armored warriors slammed their lances into cataracted cyclopean eyes and drove their blessed blades deep into swollen demon flesh. Zealots screamed and flung themselves fearlessly to their deaths. Scourges swung wildly while holy prayers drove back hulking plague toads, burning them as if the purest vitriol acid had been poured over their flesh. The shifting savage form of a wizard from the Amethyst Order matched claw for claw and fang for fang against a horror, but was quickly smothered and disappeared beneath a mass of rusted blades and scabrous limbs. The sorcerous breath of a carmine dragon lashed out, burning a blinding light across the Abbey, and smote the chest of a great unclean one, which struggled to free its house-sized bulk from the choked river of decaying flesh and writhing limbs. In the chaos, the giant man in his demigryph mount bounded with long talon-sure strides towards Tamurkhan, shouldering the plague-bearer Taliman who rose up to bar their path, pausing to savagely grab another and shake it to pieces in its razor-sharp beak and fling it aside as a cat might a mouse. The champion raised his cold blade above his head and shouted out his challenge. Undaunted, Tamurkhan, enraged, fearless, and defiant, was swift to answer, yanking out the great axe from the tainted earth beside the body of his toad dragon, and running full pelt towards the demigryph with a staggering gait, bones rattling wetly within his decaying flesh. Arcane fire burst upon Tamurkhan and swathed him in torment, causing him to stagger, and in that moment of distraction, the demigryph was on him. Its scythe-like talons, a blurred frenzy, slashing rotting meat from his diseased bones, its beak shooting forward and plucking the rotted head of the ogre clean from its body. Tamurkhan reeled, but did not fall, and the great axe licked out in a whistling side sweep and caught the demigryph in the breast, stoving in the noble beast's ribcage and cleaving its heart in two. The demigryph reared up, screaming in death agony, dragging the axe from the Maggot Lord as it did so. The giant man barely managed to scramble clear in time as the demigryph collapsed, dead as a felled tree, and he came up swinging his enchanted blade, stabbing and hacking relentlessly at the flailing bulk of the headless Tamurkhan, scoring wound after wound on the tainted flesh. The inhuman horror collapsed to one knee under the onslaught. Gushing foulness filled with writhing black worms spilled across the human champion, and gagging, he staggered backwards and slipped. It was enough for the Maggot Lord to do his work. The obscene creature lurched forth like a striking cobra and fastened itself over the man's terrified face, crunching through leather and bone, and pulsing and writhing within the flesh. Delicate bones splintered like pistol shots as the maggot forced its way down. Here was a proud vessel that would be the last he would ever need. He would not be denied. He was eternal. He was... In a roaring flash, there was nothing. All that remained of Tamurkhan was blackened, crumbling bone. He never lived to realize it, but he had fallen into a trap set by Elspeth von Draken, who had bestowed the human champion Theodore Bruckner with an amulet that was set to unleash a magical explosion at the moment of Tamurkhan's ascension. Her design had come to fruition. A whipcord of oblivion had snapped shut over the spot where Tamurkhan had stood within a hair's breadth of demonhood, and all was laid waste. The banks of the river thundered upwards and quaked, and the children of Nurgle were scattered and withered to filthy ribbons of ash in the span of a heartbeat. The Abbey and all within it ceased to be, and in the wide crater that had replaced it, a tangled mass of tortured green-black glass pierced the ground like vile daggers stabbed into the earth. And so ended the saga of Tamurkhan, he who sought the throne of chaos, but failed. And that brings our story of Tamurkhan to a close. Do check out our videos on Drazoath and Elspeth von Draken from their perspectives on these events. And we're going to go into how Tamurkhan played on the tabletop. So on the tabletop, Tamurkhan had two stat lines. One for when he was occupying the Chaos Champion Sargath, and one when he was occupying the Ogre Tyrant. He also had the rule Feast of the Maggot Lord. This essentially meant that when a model killed Tamurkhan in close combat, Tamurkhan had a chance to jump out and take possession of his attacker. This played out by both players rolling a d6, add their weapon skill value, and whoever, if Tamurkhan didn't win the roll-off, he wouldn't be able to possess you, and that'd be the end of Tamurkhan. But if he did win the roll-off, he'd be able to possess whatever model had done the final attack against him, and then keep fighting on as that character. He also had the rule Nurgle's favored son, which meant he was always the general if you picked Tamurkhan, and he was also unbreakable and caused fear, and of course had the mark of Nurgle. He also had 2 magical items, one when he was in Sargath mode, and one when he was in Ogre Tyrant mode. And in Sargath mode, he had the Rune Blade, which was armor-piercing and did multiple wounds. And in Tyrant mode, he had the Black Cleaver, which could reduce the toughness of enemy models who were hit by it. So that is how Tamurkhan used to play on the tabletop, and that brings to an end our video on Tamurkhan. And if you've liked the video, please do drop a like, subscribe, and maybe consider joining if you can. That would be great, and a huge support to the channel. Other than that, guys, as always, a huge thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys? Bye.